Welcome to you all. Welcome to this, the first of the Pukehinahina summer lectures for this year. It's great to have so many people. Morning, my wife and I were talking on the way over and we wondered how many would turn up to this a more specialist topic really about the missionaries and who'd be interested in that. Turns out quite a lot of people, so that's really good. Thank you all for coming along tonight. My name is John Hewington. I'm the vicar here. Normally I'd be slightly more formally dressed, but I went cycling this afternoon and I was a little bit sweaty when we came over, so I thought I'd put off putting on my nice shirt and I wore a t-shirt while I moved pews and things, and then I realised I had the nice shirt sitting on the couch next to the door. So at least I put on a decent t-shirt, or the other one I had on initially, shocker. I would have had to go home with that one. If you brought a phone, now's a good time just to put it on silent. If you need a toilet, at the back through, down the passageway and diagonally across the lounge, there are signs that point you. If you end up in a hall, you turn too soon or too late or something, just look out for the signs. I think there'll be a stop after about an hour, just to stretch. These pews are designed not for comfort, they're designed for people to wait during services. So about an hour, we'll be able to stand up and stretch. Those who have been before, normally at this point the church is quite hot and it's going to get a lot hotter. But this year we have wonderful air conditioning units in, or heat pumps, so they'll work as heaters during winter, which is wonderful. So I need to say thank you to TECT for their amazing support in helping us get these in. And I ordered the big banners and things so I could really kind of push them. And when I got home on Friday, I realised that I actually hadn't got to put them up. So next week we will have the TECT banners out, so we can probably thank them. But thank you, TECT. We appreciate your support. We are recording tonight, so I need to say that because apparently there's a new privacy law. So we are doing the sound, to be recorded, don't ask tricky questions. And I've kind of zoomed the camera at the back, which looks awfully like my phone. And hopefully I've chopped everyone's heads out. I think top of Terry's head's in there. It's just a tad too tall. But I'm sure he doesn't mind. So I've tried to focus on Cliff, so I just need to say that if anyone's feeling anxious about that, if you are feeling anxious about that, that side of the church will not be recorded at any point. So, to the topic. In about 2014, I think maybe 2015, one of our retired bishops, John Bluck, who was quite written quite a few books and he'd been in the paper a lot, he came here and he gave a lecture about the missionaries, and he was particularly concerned as we celebrated the bicentennial of the first missionaries coming in 2014 up at Oihi, that for many people the name of the missionaries had become synonymous with just agents of the British Empire who came here to bring British colonialism with them and to kind of feather their own nest. And he felt that was a particularly unfair representation of who they were. And he invited the Anglican Church, not just this church, but all Anglican churches, to actually re-engage the story of those first Pākehā missionaries and to, in a sense, rehabilitate that story, to retell it and to once again, they weren't perfect, but they were astounding people, the men and the women. Like we talk about the men a lot, but actually some of the real heroes were the women, and I think Cliff will talk about that. Charlotte Brown here, we talk about Alfred Brown all the time, but Charlotte, his wife, was really the mainstay of mission activity. Marion Williams up in the Bay of Islands. Without her, there is no mission. So So Cliff and I have talked about doing something around this, and he's been pondering that. He's a little consumed with writing books about the Battle of Pukehinahina with Buddy, and then rewriting his thesis about the military intelligence during the New Zealand wars. So he's got that out of the way. He's had a small break, and he's now retired. So he needed something to fill up his time. Not really, actually. He's still really busy. But this year he said he'd really like to pick up that. So many of you will have heard Cliff speak in the past. He's one of our eminent historians, local historians. And it's great that he's a member of this parish. And I always enjoy listening to him because I'm really looking forward to next week because he's going to talk about the current Battle of Pukehinahina, which is always great for me because I've got groups coming in about 2 weeks after that, and I need to brush up on my history before I start talking to them. But I'm really excited about tonight and to hear what Clifford has to say about the story of the missionaries in this country. So please put your hands together and welcome Cliff.
Just do a sound check, right? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a power on. Well, thank you, John, and tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to you all. It's great to see such a big turnout tonight. We didn't know whether this was going to be a dry topic or not. So thanks for coming along. I'm Cliff Simons, and I just want to make a little disclaimer before I start. Oh, there we go. We've got plenty of volume. I'm an Anglican. I'm a member of this congregation, as John has just said. But this is not about being an Anglican at all tonight, even though the CMS mission was an Anglican mission. I actually grew up as a Presbyterian. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, and on my journey I've been a Baptist and various other things as well. When you're in, I've moved around an awful lot and lived in a number of military camps. And when you're in military camps, there are either Roman Catholic chaplains or padres or OD, which stands for other denomination. And you never know who they'll be, but they're often Anglican, and that's probably why I ended up as an Anglican, as well as my interest in this particular location. When you entered this church, you entered under the words, all who enter here be reconciled. And we hold that sentiment really strongly here. We're very conscious of the importance of this place and of telling the story of this site, and we've expanded that out now to really some of the other areas around our colonial history. I don't have any agenda tonight. I don't have a barrow to push. I'm not trying to promote anything apart from just a general understanding of our history and our education, and our education about what has influenced our society. And of course, the story of the missionaries, there's another half to it, which is the Maori response and how that was received by the Maori and the development of the Maori church. Now, I'm not qualified to talk about that, and I'm not going to be really getting into that tonight. But we do have Reverend Dr. Hirani Carr coming in a couple of weeks' time. He may be talking about the treaty, but he has just released a very good book on the Maori church, so he can cover off that side of the topic. Some of you will know that I'm a military historian, and maybe I'm just getting outside of my swim lane a little bit tonight, but I'm not going to talk about the missionaries from the perspective of theology. Theology absolutely confuses me, and I don't want to go down there, so I'm going to take an historian's perspective of the topic. But I just looking around the room, we have a number of ministers and theologians and other people in the room, so if we have any purely questions, I'm pretty confident we've got people who can answer them for you. My first experience of missionaries was in 1980. I'd been a school teacher and I'd gone back to university, and I'd just finished a master's degree in geography. And one of the papers I'd done had been was development studies, where you look at developing countries and all of the issues around, about modernising or westernising or whatever in those countries are the issues that they had. And my sister happened to be a missionary in Papua New Guinea. This is in 1980, her and her family. And they were with the Australian Anglican Church. So Paula and I went and stayed with them for quite a period of time. And it was really quite a fascinating experience watching the stuff that I'd been learning actually happening and seeing what was happening to this community. I can still remember the village, and the people were called the Aotearoa people, and they lived in a particular valley. And the arrival of Europeans with a completely different philosophy, with knowledge of the outside world, with technology, with financial resources, was changing their life quite drastically, for good and for bad. And I remember looking at them, and I was sort of conflicted about what I saw happening. But it was happening to them anyhow. And I think I can see parallels with that and to colonial New Zealand 150, 180 years ago. And my study of the colonial wars has drawn me towards the work of the missionaries, because the story of the missionaries is just woven right through our early colonial history and right through the period of the wars. So that's why I have developed this interest in the missionaries as a sort of a secondary interest. So we'll just make a start. Here you can see the famous picture of Samuel Marsden at Rangihoa Bay arriving to preach the gospel. Now, William Wilberforce is a name that we probably all learnt about in the past, one of the great sort of humanitarian reformers in England, and he was the vice president of the Church Missionary Society, or the CMS. At the time, around about 1800, early 1800s, Great Britain was going through quite a few changes. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, of people coming in from the rural areas, living in urban poverty, and the type of work that people were undertaking, there was a movement, a humanitarian movement against slavery, child and female labour, and even it was the start of some of the legislation or the ideas around protection of animals. So there was a humanitarian movement going on. At the same time, the empire was spreading, and Britain's consciousness about the wider world was developing. People were becoming aware of other cultures. The empire was adding colonies and adding other countries, and Europe as a whole was actually spreading outwards. Now, this fellow you might have seen, he had a TV series on BBC a few years ago on the history of Great Britain. And in particular, when he was talking about the empire, he called it the empire of good intentions. Now, I guess we can think of empires that didn't have particularly good intentions. I think, say, imagine if we had become part of the Japanese Empire during the Second World War. I don't think the Japanese had particularly good intentions towards us or the other countries they occupied. There was a specific reason for that empire. But the thinking in the British Empire was that it was of a higher level than that. You can see there the Victorian values, emotional discipline, and moral and material self-improvement. And there was this feeling that by going out and creating an empire, we're going to improve other peoples. We're going to actually raise them up by being a little bit like us and by adopting the values that Great Britain had. It sounds a little bit like some of the stuff you hear about the United States at the moment. American exceptionalism, the shining city on the hill. And perhaps Americans don't quite see things from the other perspective, but they have this very strong belief that things that they do in the world are generally for the good. There was a belief in free trade and market economics, that the empire was all about trade. And the idea that you could develop institutions and democracy and eventually leave the colonies being self-reliant. And that happened to a large extent. Britain, when it withdrew from its colonies, did leave its institutions in place to some extent. Simon Sharma was mainly focusing on Ireland and India, and he was very critical about this concept of the empire of good intentions. And although the good intentions were there, the actual damage that was done was quite significant. So I'm not trying to gloss over that. And by the 1830s, the question is starting to be asked about the validity of imposing these ideas and these values on other countries. And in particular, what's the value of Christianity in this area? You know, during the process of colonisation, what's the role of Christianity? Does that make it better? Does that justify this process of colonisation to some extent? This is a map that I really love this map, and it's hard to see from where you are. I put that date on it. So this is later on than the period we're talking about. But as a boy, I grew up really proud of the fact that we were sort of at the tail end of the British Empire, that a lot of the globe was red, the sun never set, a sixth of the world's population were part of the British Empire, and we down here in New Zealand were part of that as well. If I just show you a little bit more detail, this is, I think, encapsulates some of the thinking. There's Britannia sitting there and being held up by Atlas, sitting on top of the world, and you've got obviously indigenous people or native people, as they would have said there. You've got the exotic images from India, you've got the hunter or the explorer, you've got the exotic animals. This is the way that people who were coming to New Zealand, this is the environment that they probably, or the ideas that they had in their mind when they were coming here. And perhaps the most famous of all of the heroes of Victoria was David Livingston. He, in a way, encapsulated the values and the essence of that empire and that idea of Britishness. In an era where you didn't have pop stars and movie stars and Formula One drivers and supermodels and so on, the heroes of Victorian England were some of the politicians, the royal family, the admirals and the generals, and the explorers, people like that, maybe some of the engineers and so on. But he was arguably the most famous. He grew up in very humble beginnings in Scotland. He worked in a cotton mill with his family. He studied at night. He did well. He was obviously talented. He goes off to university. It's all about hard work and sacrifice. Becomes a medical doctor. Becomes a missionary. And becomes an explorer. And goes to, do you remember the term deepest, darkest Africa? Goes to there and brings Christianity, commerce and medicine, and he fights the slave trade, and he's operating in the area of the Zambezi River, and he is admired. And then to finish it all off, he sort of dies tragically in Africa, and he gives his life, if you like. And so that's a very interesting sort of image, I think, of a Victorian hero. There's a photograph of him here. It's a little bit hard to see, but on that side you can see people who I think are kneeling in prayer. There's someone having their chains taken off. Someone else, the children are being fed. So this is the imagery that was important. The last image that I just want to show you here is Queen Victoria passing a Bible to a prince from some part of the empire. Now, it's not actually true, but it's said at the bottom right there, it says it's based on the popular unfounded anecdote. But the Queen is supposed to have said, when asked by a diplomatic delegation how Britain had become powerful in the world, our beloved Queen sent her not the number of her fleet, not the number of her armies, not the account of her boundless merchandise, not the details of her inexhaustible wealth, but handing him a beautifully bound copy of the Bible, she said, tell the prince that this is the secret of England's greatness. And so there's almost a sense of that Christianity is British as well. Certainly that it's something to be shared with the rest of the world. So if we just think about Great Britain in the early 1800s, it was a time of religious fervour. You know, these things go through cycles, but there was a period of religious fervour. There were preachers who were very famous who could go into to halls or churches and draw crowds of thousands. It was also a time of social mobility where people were moving up, and you could become, by becoming a minister or becoming a missionary, you actually were improving your social standing as well. The opportunities to be in the clergy had traditionally been based around the Oxford and Cambridge universities, but during this period of time, other ways of becoming ordained started to develop. And the CMS missionaries were evangelical missionaries. That's how they thought, that's how they were trained, and that's what they intended to do. So they were going to take the gospel to the world, and part of being evangelical was this belief that the people who were converted would have a personal conversion. So the CMS was founded in 1799. And the first missionaries actually had difficulty finding their first set of missionaries, and they had to get some German Lutherans who were sent to West Africa. And they drew the short straw because I think it was mainly in Sierra Leone. Some of these people only lived for a matter of weeks. It was very, very tough for people from Europe to go to some parts of Africa, and their life expectancy was very, very short, compared to most of the missionaries who came to New Zealand who lived to old age if they stayed in New Zealand. In 1809, the first missionaries from New Zealand. So New Zealand was the second cab off the rank, if you like. And by 1820, the organisation had become established enough that this was the headquarters and the training centre, or the training college, in Islington in North London. So it became quite substantial. Now, if we just come across to focusing more on the New Zealand side of it now, we've got three interesting characters who are part of the early, the story of the very first part of the missionary effort in New Zealand. Te Pahi was a chief from the Rangihoa area in the Bay of Islands, and in 1805 he went to Sydney with his 4 sons. He went to see the governor. He had actually hoped that he might get as far as the United Kingdom, but he went over there, met the governor, also met Samuel Marsden, and he returned back to New Zealand with a medal with his name engraved on it, and with a prefabricated house that the Governor King, had given him. Now, Samuel Marsden was the chaplain to the penal colony in Sydney, and he had established himself at Parramatta. He was also a magistrate, and he was an astute businessman, and he developed a farm of about 3,000 acres. And he had tried to evangelise the Australian Aboriginals, and they weren't open to Christianity at all. There was just no progress there. And he started to think in terms of New Zealand. Now, he met Te Pahi. Te Pahi came and saw his operations at Parramatta, and they started to talk in terms of the potential of a mission in New Zealand. The third person there is a younger man than Te Pahi. He's Ruatara. He's from the same area, and he was also going overseas at this time. He was travelling the world and was in England when Marsden went back to England in 1807 to talk to the CMS and get permission to establish a mission in New Zealand. And he found Ruatara, who had been travelling for several years. He had been beaten, he was in very poor health, and he was on a ship called the Anne that was travelling back to Sydney. So Marsden nursed him back to health, and they got talking and they developed a friendship. And Ruatara stayed with Marsden until 1810. So this is the foundation for what was to happen. In 1809, when Ruatara and Marsden were still heading back to Sydney, there was a ship called the Boyd that was burnt in the Whangaroa harbour. Now there were ships coming into New Zealand at this time trading for kauri spars. The spars were useful for shipping, for masts and other things, and there was quite a trade in this. And the Whangaroa harbour was quite a small, narrow, sort of enclosed harbour. The Boyd was in there, and it was attacked. Now the reason it was attacked is because there had been a young chief travelling back to New Zealand on the Boyd, and he had fallen foul of the captain, and the captain had had him flogged with a cat of nine tails, which wasn't uncommon those days, but it turned out to be a pretty poor decision, because when this young chief got back, he told his family what had happened, and of course the wider whānau attacked the ship. There were 70 crew on board. Some of them climbed up the masts and tried to escape. The ship was surrounded. Eventually it caught fire, the gunpowder exploded. The 70 crew were killed, and quite a number of them were eaten as a revenge for the flogging that was taken. Now the upside of this is that, or the initial response to this, is that a whaling crew took exception and looked for revenge, and they mistook the name of the chief who had led this raid on the Boyd, and they thought it was Te Pāhi, and they raided his village and he was killed. And so that put the plans of the mission back, because unfortunately he was killed. And Governor Macquarie, it was then, in New South Wales, put a ban on any Europeans coming to, or any that he had authority over, coming to New Zealand because it was just considered too dangerous. And a lot of ships' captains wouldn't come, because, and if they did come, they certainly wouldn't get their ships in a situation where they could be attacked like that. Now this is just in the paper. It was on the Stuff website a couple of days ago. This gentleman, Hugh Rehari, is the kaitiaki of the Raumahoa Heritage Park, which is where the Marsden Cross and where this all took place. And he made some interesting comments. He actually was saying that this is probably the true birthplace of New Zealand rather than Waitangi. We all talk about Waitangi being the birthplace, but this is actually where the two races, Maori and Pakeha, came together, worked on a project together, and actually established something. And this is a generation before Waitangi. And the place is a little bit out of the way, and it's not visited anywhere near as much as Waitangi, but I think he's actually got a valid point. So I've spelled this out in a bit of detail, and I hope you can read it, but I'll get confused if I don't do this. So Ruatara had enough of being in Parramatta with Marsden by 1810, and he and a number of other Maori went back to the Bay of Islands. Marsden waited another 5 years, and he couldn't get permission, he still wasn't allowed to visit New Zealand, and so he purchased his own ship called the Active, and he sent two missionaries who he had brought out from England a number of years earlier to do a reconnaissance, to see if it was possible to set up a mission station and to make contact with Ruatara. The contact worked out well, and they were well received, and Ruatara, Hongi Hika and several other Maori came back to Sydney, and they essentially planned the establishment of a mission station. And by late 1814, Governor Macquarie gave Marsden permission to go to New Zealand. He gave him 4 months leave, and he could go to New Zealand and establish this mission. So Marsden was on board the ship, a few other people, and the mission families, and as you can see there, 8 Maori, 2 sawyers, a smith, 2 mares, 1 bull, 2 cows, sheep, goats and chickens, obviously to sustain the mission families when they got there. And there's an interesting story about Marsden hopping on one of the horses and riding it around, and people were just astonished. They could not believe that such an animal existed and that you could ride it like that, because they'd obviously never seen it before. Marsden had actually sent some plants to Ruatara earlier as well, and one of them was wheat. And there's an interesting story where he had grown some wheat, and other members of the community had laughed at him because they pulled the wheat up and found there were no tubers underneath, because food plants were plants that had tubers underneath them, and so he was being mocked. So what he did, he ground the wheat, mixed it with water, and fried it in a frying pan and made a biscuit, and introduced this new idea of food. So it's an interesting thought. So this is the famous photograph of Samuel Marsden preaching at Ohi Bay on Christmas Day 1814. And standing next to him in his military uniform that he'd been given by Governor Macquarie is Ruatara. And he explained, because he actually knew how church worked, because he'd been in Parramatta with Marsden for quite a couple of years. He understood how it worked, and so he explained to the congregation of about 300 what Marsden was saying. And it's possible that Marsden had a little bit of Terrell as well, because he'd been spending time with Maori back in Australia or New South Wales. And the other person in the uniform is Hongi Hika, and he becomes part of the story soon. You can see Rangahoa Pa up on the top, and flying up on the top was the Union Jack. So there was a real effort to welcome Marsden and the missionaries. Now, Marsden had a strange idea that you had to, of the way of converting Maori was going to be through the idea of teaching them European skills. And so the early missionaries were tradespeople who had practical skills. And the idea was that you would teach them practical skills, you would teach them British etiquette, you would teach them industry, if you like, or how to make things, and then that civilized them. And once they were civilized, they could then be converted. So that was his idea of the way that he thought about it. Here's another image of Rangihaia. It's a little bit hard to see perhaps, but you can see the pa up on the hill and the mission settlement on the side there. But this mission settlement was a bit of a disaster. It was very difficult for the people. You can see that William and Dinah Hall, John and Hannah King, Thomas and Jane Kendall, these were the first people who arrived, and you can see the trades that they had. They found it very difficult to establish a mission here. The place wasn't fertile. They couldn't grow their crops. The animals didn't really thrive. And the personalities were difficult. I think in particular Thomas Kendall was a difficult person. Because he was a school teacher, he thought he was the most important. He was more educated. He thought he should be the leader of the community. And him and his wife were having, their marriage basically blew up. So they were having problems. And it was a difficult place to be. And it was just, they weren't making progress. What made it worse was Ruatara died within days of the establishment of the mission. He was already sick when Marsden left a few days after having preached on Christmas Day, and it was apparent that he was going to die, and he did die. And in those days, any Europeans needed a Maori protector. They needed a chief to be their patron. And he was going to be their patron and their guardian. He died, and so that came now that Hongi Hika would be their patron, and they would live under his authority, if you like. There's the place now. It's really, if you haven't been there, I really would recommend it. It's a fabulous place to go. The pa was up on the hill, and the mission village was down in the area here, and it actually stayed there until the early 1830s. So 4 years later, another mission station was established. Marsden made 7 visits to New Zealand in total, and this time the mission station was established at Kirikeri. at the head of the inlet. And you all recognise the Stone Store and Kemp House. And James Kemp and his wife lived in that house, and it was established by John Butler, who had become the head of the CMS mission in New Zealand. There is Hongi Hika and Thomas Kendall. In 1820, Thomas Kendall was very unsatisfied. He was struggling with the whole concept of the mission. As I've said, he thought he should have been in charge of it. He wanted to be ordained, and he had actually started to drift towards learning much more about Maori culture, and he started to immerse himself in Maoriness rather than CMS-ness, if you like. And he actually even developed a Maori vocabulary, a written vocabulary that he had printed in Sydney. He went back to England and took Hongi Hika and another chief called Waikato back to England. Hongi Hika wanted to meet the King George IV, and they actually ended up going to Cambridge University, where there was a Professor Lee who was a linguist. And they worked with Professor Lee for a couple of months, and he worked out a better English, or a Maori dictionary, and this was the basis for some of the translation of Maori into a written language. They were the toast of the town in London. They were very exotic-looking people, and they received gifts from the king. And when they came back via Sydney, Hongi Hika had 12 muskets and a suit of armour. He cashed in the gifts in Sydney and came to New Zealand with about 300 muskets and quite a lot of powder. And on the ship back, he was with some other chiefs, so you can see how much travelling there was between New Zealand and the Australian colonies. And he calmly informed them that he'd be going to be attacking them soon, which is what happened. This is a picture of the Kirikeri Inlet right at the head. If you just look up at the top there, you can see the Stone Store. The Stone Store was actually a storehouse for the mission, particularly the mission in Waimati. So they would produce the food on the mission farm in Waimati. It would come down and be stored at the Stone Store, and then it would go out through the inlet. But that piece of land here, the bare piece of land that you can see looks like an old plant site, is Kororipo Pa. And that's the pa from which the Ngāpuhi war parties departed on their great expeditions during the Musket Wars. For at least 5 years, the war parties came out of there, hundreds and hundreds of men. And they attacked right down through the North Island. Firstly, the tribes around them, and then later right down. They certainly came down here into Tawari a couple of times, down as far as Gisborne, up the Waikato River as far as Pukehinahina, and various other places. Defeating people, because they were musket armed, they had tremendous victories. And it's considered that the death toll during the whole Musket Wars period was at least 20,000, perhaps maybe 25,000, which is about a quarter of the Maori population. Now, the missionaries in Kemp House were witness to some awful scenes when the boats came back. Jane, I think her name is Jane Kemp, Mrs. Kemp, kept a diary which I've read, and when the war parties would come back, people would be just murdered. They brought a lot of prisoners back, and these people would be murdered, and then there would be carried on for the next couple of weeks where people would be killed and sleeping. The carnage that was going on was appalling. I think that's one of the saddest places in New Zealand. I've said there's been a lot of tremendous sadness. And so that happened during the Musket Wars. And the Musket Wars actually lasted for probably 15 years, well into the 1830s. Now, the missionaries got involved, to their shame, in the musket trade. The only currency that Hongi Hika was interested in for food was muskets. The only currency really that was important in New Zealand at the time was muskets. And Kendall in particular, and one or two others, actually ended up trading muskets for food. And that's something that was held against the missionaries. Things were about to change though. So in 1823, this man arrived, and he's a giant in the story of the Church Missionary Society, Henry Williams. He'd been a naval officer, and you know, after the Napoleonic Wars, people were put on half pay. So he was on half pay and was looking for another profession, and eventually offered himself for the mission. Went to Islington, trained up as a missionary. And he was a little bit older than some of the other missionaries. He was 31 when he arrived in New Zealand. Marion was 28. They already had 3 children. They would go on to have 11. He brought a sort of a discipline and a leadership to the mission and turned it around, because it really had been failing. Butler, who you saw earlier on, Marsden sacked him for drunkenness. He had been the leader of the mission. So they were really in turmoil until Henry Williams arrived. He prepared himself well by learning about boat building, a lot of the skills that he would need, medical skills, of course all the missionary type of skills that he would require. One of the first things he did was stop the trade in muskets, and he tried to break this reliance that the missionaries still had on food from the Maori. He tried to break them free from the control. He saw the control that Hongi Hika in particular had over the missionaries. So he moved away from that area to Paihia, and there was another chief, and particularly the chief's wife, who owned the land of Paihia, who threw their cloak, if you like, over that mission. And rather than Marsden's emphasis on trades and teaching the skills, and then trying to sort of civilise Maori, which in that sort of concept, he immediately decided that they needed to emphasise spiritual teaching. And because he was such a strong personality, he also became a peacemaker. And he would travel great distances around the North Island. He was very influential, he was brave, and in the end he was mediating. You know, different tribes would invite him in, and he would mediate. So this increased his mana, and the mana of the other missionaries greatly. So this was a real boost. And he also started to realise what was happening in New Zealand. There were an awful lot of land speculators coming across from the Australian colonies. There was a lot of dirty dealing around land, the purchase of land, and he realised that something needed to be done to protect Maori from a lot of the fraudulent practices that were happening. So here's the Paihia mission station, and it's called Heavenside, and I'll tell you why in a second. So this is established in 1823. If you come from Kawakawa and you drive down the hill and down into Paihia, you turn left along the waterfront, and that's the waterfront there. And the mission station was this first group of buildings. There's still a stone church there at the moment, which is the third church on the site. And Paula and I were really fortunate to be there the week before Christmas and go to their carols and reading service. And it was a real treat to be in doing that. It was on a site that was so significant. And the town of Paihia at the moment is over, you can see the little outcrop there. On the other side of that is where the little shopping centre in Paihia. So that was the mission station. And it was run very formally. You can see it was all nice straight lines. It was very orderly and well laid out. The bells would ring for prayers at certain times of the day, and it was all done very well. The missionaries got together and they would have classes where they would learn to speak to Braille. They would try and develop their skills because they knew that they needed to have those skills to be able to communicate. And then they were practicing, they were doing their preaching as well. And of course the school teaching. And that usually fell to the women. So Marianne, as well as having a whole bunch of kids and running a mission station, cooking outside, all of those other things, was actually running a school at the same time. Mainly for girls. They would separate the boys from the girls. They did these long missionary journeys. They were exploring and looking for new sites, but also just getting food. And in some of the journals you see, we got a quantity of potatoes in Tauranga and they were pleased because they were going to bring it back and feed them. The mission, basic medical skills, and of course translating. And the translating, I'll just jump ahead. Now across at Russell, what we call Russell now, Aotearoa-New was a terrible place. The hellhole of the Pacific, the very seat of Satan. This was just the complete opposite to the way the mission station was being run over in Paihia. There were about 18 bars and brothels on the foreshore, and the whaling ships would come in and they would there was a spring on the waterfront in Russell, and they would get water, they would fill their water barrels, and they would replenish the food supplies, and there was also always a supply of young women for them as well. And in fact, sometimes I've read Marion's diaries, and she talks about how the girls had disappeared for a couple of weeks, and then they come back later on. So as far as the missionaries were concerned, this was just an awful place. This was an important stage for them, the launching of this boat. This 50-ton bark was built on the beach at Paihia. It's called the Herald, and it was built by boat builders who came across from New South Wales, and a lot of the Maori as well, who were provided a lot of the labour and the wood skills. And when this thing was built, it gave them a freedom, once again, to travel further and to acquire more food. And this ship actually went to Australia, or the Australian colonies, 4 times, and it went around New Zealand. But it was wrecked in about 1828, I think, so it had a short but productive life. Now, Christianity had initially not really been particularly attractive to Maori, to the majority of Maori. Missionaries couldn't even feed themselves, the missionaries couldn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, and there were lots of other Europeans around. The missionaries seemed to be a strange little group compared to the whalers or the other types that were around. But missionaries were useful for trade. If you had a missionary or a trader or some other European, it meant that ships were going to come and go. So it was a window to the outside world and a window to produce. But the main thing, of course, and the real boost now is the translation of the Gospels. In 1826, Henry's brother arrived, and he was a natural linguist, and he started working on the Gospel. And they started to produce tracts, and these became very valuable, and they were treasured, and they became trade goods. And Maori would come from miles and miles, or chiefs would send someone from miles away to go and get some of this information. The idea that the Word of God could be in a little book or in this thing was quite remarkable to them, and they were very, very interested in it. And all you needed was someone in the community who could read, often a child that was going to the school, and they would read the Bible. It wasn't the Bible at the stage, it was just tracts. And they would read, say, the story of the Good Samaritan. And they would read that, and then the community would discuss it. And they would sit around and talk about it and what the implications of that were, and compare it to what they knew and what they thought about things. And this is part of the way that the story of the Bible started to be translated. The first baptism, as you can see there, was an elderly chief who decided that he wanted to embrace this new religion as early as 1825, but he was a bit of an outlier. There weren't many conversions until around 1830. The 4th mission station that was developed was the one that we now call it Waimate North, but Tawari. And this became a real centre, and this finally gave the mission station some economic independence. A very fertile land in that area. It's just inland from Kirikeri. It was linked by a cartway to Kirikeri. And it became a farm, a boarding school, so the missionaries now have got children who need to go to school. And there are also some young Maori now who are starting to go to school as well, to boarding school. Hinare Taratoa, who's one of the young men in our story here in Tawari, actually may have gone to school here briefly before it became St John's College and moved to Auckland. It became a translation centre and a printery, and it's also Bishop Selwyn's home from 1842 onwards when he arrived as the first bishop. And this is what it looked like, quite a productive farm. It was a little piece of England in the middle of the New Zealand countryside. And another big breakthrough occurred a few years later. 21-year-old William Colenso arrived, and he was a printer. And this is very similar to the press that he brought. And they could now churn out huge quantities of tracts. And they started to work on the New Testament. And the New Testament was 345 pages. And so it was a massive enterprise, even getting the paper to do that. And they apparently upwards of 60,000 copies were sent out. One per two Maori, it was thought, owned a copy of the New Testament sometime in the 1840s. So it spreads out across the country. Another aspect that I've alluded to is the peacekeeping. This is, I think, Archdeacon Brown. Brown arrived at Paihia just before 1830, so he would have gone through the similar sort of experience to most of the missionaries arriving in New Zealand, learning the language, learning the culture, going out, preaching, and then going further afield and peacekeeping. This is in the Waikato. This is down in Wellington. You can see the missionary. These are the sort of images that would have appeared in the newspapers and journals back in England, by the way. But here's the missionary stopping a war party, and you can see him pointing to the good book there. And this is one that's closer to home. This is Tawari's war party coming down to attack Aotearoa-New in 1832. And they came down, a huge number came down, and in the middle there you can see a little sailing vessel called Tawari, the Messenger. And that's got Williams and a few other missionaries and some boys from the school who came down to try and stop this war party that came down and actually laid siege to the Aotearoa and was unsuccessful. And then went and had a go at one or two other places and then sailed home unsuccessfully. So these are the sort of peacekeeping activities. Just another little interesting thing that you all recognise this flag. This flag we now associate with Maori independence or Maori autonomy. It's not the Tino Rangatiratanga flag. It's actually the New Zealand, it's actually the Church Missionary Society flag. And it's quite interesting. I think I'm often quite amused that it's been repurposed for something quite different. But that was the flag that was used by the CMS. When the shipping from New Zealand started to go to Sydney, you obviously needed to fly under a flag. And there was a case where a ship sailed into Sydney Harbour and was captured, and the authorities said that it was a ship with no flag, therefore it was illegal. And so Busby, James Busby, who was by now the New Zealand consul in New Zealand, had 3 flags made in Sydney and had them brought over. And I've actually seen mock-ups of these 3 flags. And the flags were flown, and there were 24 or 26 chiefs who were asked to choose which was the flag that they wanted to represent their ships and New Zealand. And the flags were flown. This one got 12 votes, another one got 10, and I think the other flag got 2 or 4, and that's how that became New Zealand's first flag. But strangely, or interestingly, there's actually the CMS flag. There are variations of it. The borders can be slightly different, but it's basically the CMS flag. And as I've said at the bottom there, this is the first hand embryonic time that the chiefs sort of come together and think about themselves as New Zealand rather than as individual chiefs. And it's part of that journey towards the treaty. So by 1830, most of the well-known missionaries had arrived in New Zealand, people like Alfred Brown, for instance, Baptisms were starting. The economics of the mission were going well, being well led, and there were attempts to spread out. It was now time to go into the rest of the country. And some of the mission stations were established most of them were actually established in the late 1830s and early 1840s. But some of them were failures, and we know that in Tauranga here there were several attempts to establish one before it finally was done, and that's because of the intertribal fighting that was still taking place. Some of you will know the story of Tawari, the little girl who was killed on the Kaimai, so I'll just tell you a little bit. So that story happens during this period. Once again, Brown, Morgan, and a few other missionaries established a mission station at Matamata, just where the road bridge goes over the railway line at Wakaroa. You look over to the left, there's a cemetery there, that's where the mission station was. And it only lasted about a year because there was a war going on between the Rotorua, Aotearoa and the Ngāti Hoa in that area, and Tauranga was slightly involved. They were allies of Ngāti Hoa. The missionaries sent their wives and children were sent back to a safer place, and the missionaries stayed in the very rudimentary building that they had. The place was very dangerous for them. They were burying their clothes and possessions in metal boxes and in the ground, and after a few weeks they would get them out and air them, and then they would bury them again. And eventually the mission was attacked, and they had to leave. But during that time, a group decided that they had to make a run for it, and they were going towards, they were going to try and get to Tauranga away from the war parties, the Arawa war parties that were looking for them. And Tawari was part of that group. And they spent the night at the Wairere Falls on the other side of the Kaimais there. And the war party caught up with them, and Tawari was killed. And the interesting part about it, well, there's several interesting parts of that story. One of them is that she was wearing a copy of the St. Luke's Gospel that had been given to her by Mrs. Brown. And that Gospel found its way to Rotorua, found its way to Otaki, and eventually the Christian message ended up going right down through to the South Island, but that's a whole other story. But her father was Ngā Kuku, and they buried her at Pa in Matamata the next day, and he decided, he said we would not seek revenge, that he would forgive his enemies. And that had quite a downstream effect as well. So you can see how the change in thinking was starting to take place. In 1838, we had one of the most significant chiefs in Ngāpui declaring, you can see what he says there, Tamati Wakamana. And there was probably a war weariness. The country had been at war now for nearly 2 decades. There had been that huge death toll. The introduced diseases were taking effect. Maori were dying, and they didn't know why. And the old tohara didn't seem to have any way of stopping that. And maybe this message that the missionaries are talking about with their God maybe there's something in that. And in the late 1830s, there seemed to be quite a move, quite a range of conversions. The treaty, a couple of years later, now Henry Williams is once again absolutely crucial in the treaty story. I don't think he realised that Hobson was arriving, but of course he was the go-to man when Captain Hobson arrived and wanted someone to translate his ideas into a document in Maori so that he could give it to the chiefs and ask them to think about it. So Williams and his son Edward drafted the treaty. And he has been criticised for his drafting of it and his explanation of it. Words like kawanatanga and rangatiratanga and we could talk about that for hours, but he was crucial in the whole process. That's him. You see the gentleman in the yellow cloak, that's Honi Heki, and the head just above him is Williams. So he was right at the top table, and he was explaining to the chiefs what the treaty meant. Later that night, when the chiefs went back down to Titi Marae, he went and answered their questions and explained what it meant. And then the next day, the chiefs had decided that they were ready to sign. So probably he is absolutely decisive in his support for the treaty. By the 1840s and the period 1840 to 1860, there are mission stations right across the North Island. And it's thought that up to 50,000 Maori might have been attending worship, all denominations. That figure may be a little bit high, but certainly there were probably about 5,000 to 6,000 Roman Catholics, maybe 10,000 to 12,000 Wesleyans, and well over 30,000 CMS or Anglican Maori who had adopted Christianity to some extent. And of course, it wouldn't be, it's going to be some sort of a melding of their beliefs and these new beliefs that are coming. But by 1860, there seems to be evidence that already an interest in the mission church was starting to wane. Now, I think this might be just a good time to stand up and have a quick stretch. I'm getting close to the end, but let's have a stretch. These pews are a bit stiff, and it's a toilet break from there. Right, so we'll just carry on. Now I know you can't see the sign, the words here, but it's just interesting to see. So by 1845, this is how far the CMS had spread throughout the North Island, right down to the Wellington region there. And you notice that they're mainly in the centre and on the east coast. The Wesleyan missions had spread that far, and they're mainly on the west coast, and there was a kind of an agreement that they would separate like that. And then the Roman Catholic missions were smaller in number, and they're in those locations there. The Roman Catholic missions, I think, were quite different to the CMS and the Wesleyan ones. The CMS and Wesleyans got on very well. They were the same nationality, and then probably they were the same social class in most cases as well. Whereas the Roman Catholics were, not only were they Roman Catholic as far as the missions, the CMS, which was terrible, because just think back in history, another previous 100 years or so, and they were burning each other at the stake and persecuting each other. But to make it even worse, they were French. They weren't even Irish. And the French are the traditional enemy of Great Britain. And Williams had been a naval officer during the Napoleonic Wars, as had, his name's just gone out of my mind, but one of the missionaries here as well, Wilson, had been a naval officer as well. So these are the enemy, both nationally and theologically. And there's all sorts of funny stories about how one Maori community might become Roman Catholic, so because the other one had become Anglican or something like that, and they did it almost to see the fun. There were occasions where the missionaries would debate each other and were really damning of each other. I think it was quite hard for the Roman Catholic missionaries because they lived in the villages, or in the paths themselves, or in the community. And it was quite a hard life that they led. Whereas over time, the CMS missionaries ended up living in quite nice houses. Somewhere along the line, they would build a nice mission house, and it was relatively comfortable. But the Catholics were right there, living amongst the people in a much different way. And of course, they were celibate, they were single. And that confounded a lot of the Maori. They couldn't quite understand what that was all about. And we had a Roman Catholic mission here in Tauranga until from 1840 through to 1863, I think, just before the Battle of Pukehinahina. So they're a big part of the story as well. So what happened on mission stations? Just very briefly, I have a friend who used to talk about this years ago, and he used to say they were essentially like a polytech. So at a mission station, there was obviously the literacy and the numeracy in their own language that was taught. There was all the evangelization, the training up of mission teachers to go out into the villages and the communities. But there were also Western farming skills, animal husbandry, all around growing of the crops, boat building, fences, all of that sort of stuff. There was a whole range of things that the missionaries were trying to do as well. And they had staff who were sent over to help do that sort of thing. So they were a big undertaking. Before people were baptised, they had to undergo examinations to make sure that they understood what they were getting into. They had to do recitations of parts of the Bible and all of that sort of thing. So it was a big operation. I just want to talk briefly about the Missionary Women. John alluded to this at the start. We talk about, this is Victorian England, right? So we talk about the men. But the story of the Mission Women hasn't been forgotten. There are numerous books about it. But their contribution was just extraordinary. This is Marion Williams, the woman who came with Henry as a 28-year-old and had 11 children, lived to old age, and just put up with the most extraordinary situation, running a school, running a household, dealing with all the visitors. And this is the first house they lived in on the beach at Paihia, which was a raupo hut and a sailcloth stretched over a frame. And they lived in that for years until they could build a proper house. And in the early days, they were in danger. She was attacked, they were attacked, they were assaulted, all of their stuff was stolen. And this is in sort of the very early time when they were trying to establish themselves. It was a very precarious existence. Here are, I think this must be the 1860s, because that's about when photography starts to be available in New Zealand. And those are some of the very senior women. I think their husbands all might have been bishops in the end. So I've just explained their roles. Most of them came to New Zealand as young women. So we think of them now as old ladies, you see that sort of photo. But often one of the first things, or the last things that would happen before you left England was you got married. And you would marry in your mid-20s. There's really nothing that's going to prepare you to go to the other end of the world and never see your family again, never see your parents again, and live in those sort of conditions in New Zealand. And the missionaries that arrived were generally under 30 years of age and young and inexperienced people, but just full of that sort of zeal. There were instances of serious depression and mental health. I was reading recently about Bishop Selwyn's wife, who was trying to run the mission station at Waitangi. Hundreds of visitors a year coming and going, lots of Maori coming and going, running a household, running a school, running some sort of a medical thing, and she just found it just overwhelming, and she just crashed for a while. They were fearful for their lives, and they were often desperately lonely. Marion Williams talked about her widowhood, because Henry would go away for months on end on his peacekeeping missions or other things, and she was stuck back at home. And I've read, there's an interesting book on her diaries, and she would write away to her parents or her sisters in England, she wants some gingham for the girls' dresses. And 12 months later, if she's lucky, a ship might arrive. And if she's lucky, the package of gingham will be there, but it's gotten wet, so it's rotted. Well, there's no paper to write on, and things like that. You never, and you never see your parents again. As they aged, the children of the mission people often intermarried, and so you had a second generation, because they were still quite a small group of people. Quickly on the spread of Christianity by Maori, and this is quite important. I've called it the returnees from the north, but often when the chiefs in the far north would convert to Christianity, the missionaries put a lot of pressure on them to release their slaves. And there were an awful lot of slaves being held in the far north that had been captured during the Muscat War period. And Rauri Pukehinahina, as an example here, there were people from Tawari here who were being held up in the north. And so they start coming back through, and certainly after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, those people start coming back through and settling back and coming back to their home areas. And of course they bring a lot of the things they've learned from the far north. They bring the literacy in their own language, they bring the farming skills and things like that, and they bring Christianity. And so they are actually planting churches or little communities before the European missionaries even get there. So down in Wellington, for instance, in the Hutt Valley, there is a pa with a little chapel, but there hasn't been a missionary down in Wellington yet. And the same in various other parts of New Zealand. And they've taken it down, they've sort of learned a bit about it, and they are teaching this new philosophy, this new religion to their people. There were also, and the fact that they had just literally come back from the dead gave them astonishing mana when they returned to their communities as well. There were Maori Christian teachers who were trained up to go out and teach in their communities and take the Christian message. Aotearoa-New is an example of that. But it took a long, and so they were trained up by the missionaries and sent out. And they are really doing a lot of the legwork of spreading the gospel. And then there are the ordained clergy. And it took quite a long time for the first Maori clergy to be ordained. That's the gentleman there, Waitoa, in Auckland, who was deaconed in 1853. And there was a small, I guess, a number of Maori clergy in the early period. But the Kingitanga is interesting as well. Pukehinahina, I've put his photo up there because I think he's a crucial figure in the whole story. We talked about the mission station at Matamata being a failure. Well, he actually converted to Christianity in 1839. It was actually Brown who converted him, and that had a significant effect on his iwi. He built 2 pacifist villages, and he actually built a church that they say could hold 1,000 people. It's hard to imagine. And he became a very powerful example of Christianity. And when the Kingitanga was established in 1858, one of his names is the Kingmaker. When the Maori king was established, he held the Bible over the king's head as he was being coronated, as an indication that the Kingitanga would be under the authority of the Bible. It would be a Christian-based organisation. Now, war broke out in 1860, and we could speak for a long time. I'm just going to go very briefly, but the war really was really the death knell for a lot of the mission activity. The first war broke out in the Taranaki in 1860, then through the Waikato in 1863 and 4, over here into Tawari, and then it just carried on through the rest of the decade. And the missionaries were really conflicted. They saw the Maori as their flock, but of course they were still Victorian English people, and they had all these values that they had brought with them. And in some ways they had been fundamental in in making significant changes in Maori society, and changes in a sense. So they had a dog in the fight, if you like. They had some skin in the game, and it was also very complicated. For instance, here in Tawari, it would be easy to think that all of the Maori here in Kaupapa, for instance, were supported by all of the other Maori, and it was Maori against the British Army, but it wasn't like that at all. There were Maori who were vehemently against the government, there were Maori who were undecided and sitting on the fence, and there were some who were actually still supporting the government and feeding information and so on to the government. So it wasn't clear cut, and so the missionaries are kind of caught in this middle ground. What is their stance? And each one of them had a different stance. But in total, the kingitanga was probably a step too far for most of the missionaries. They had a concept of Maori becoming part of the British Empire under the authority of the governor, under the authority of Queen Victoria, and to be setting up a rival monarch, a king within this country, was a step too far for most of the missionaries. Certainly a step too far for this gentleman here, John Morgan, who was a long-standing missionary in Aotearoa-New Zealand. And that church there dates back to 1854, so that was a church on his very successful mission station. And he had been part of the process of that region becoming very prosperous. And there were hundreds of acres of farms and that were owned by Maori and mills. It's said that the flour from that area was actually being exported to Australia and even as far as the Californian goldfields. But he was very fixed in his mind that the Maori were rebelling, and he became a spy master. He was passing information about what was happening in his region back to Governor Paul Brown. And in the end, he was evicted from the Waikato by Rewi Poto. But he is at the far end, and he was roundly criticised by a lot of the missionaries, and so they kind of fill the spectrum, if you like. Here's another one. After the wars came to an end, a lot of Maori were dispossessed of their land. It is estimated that only 15% of Maori remained in the Waikato, for instance. There were hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of acres of land was confiscated. And a lot of Maori were living destitute outside of their areas because they were now in exile. There's just an image that I've got there. But this is a comment from Reverend Grace, who did some time here in Tawari. I'll read it just because it might be hard to read. They say when they saw their bishop and missionaries who had possessed their confidence, as they supposed, counselling and leading their enemies, they lost their confidence and became our bitterest enemies. That we came to this country and taught them to lift up their eyes to heaven, while we ourselves kept ours turned down to the land. For our own work's sake, I think we ought to let them see that in this respect we are walking honestly towards them. And there are some who actually, some Maori who claim that Bishop Selwyn even burnt a Roman Catholic church at Rangiaowhia. Archbishop Moxon was very clear about that he wasn't there at the time. But this is just an indication that that the Maori lost confidence in the mission church as a result of these things. And so we start to see the development of syncretic religions, or sometimes they're called adjustment religions, Haimariri, Ringatu, even Ratana is an adjustment to, it's a way of finding yourself in a world that's been put into a washing machine. It's looking for a Maori response to Christianity, an indigenous version of this religion that has come. And the church, a lot of the mission stations closed at this point. Okay, so if we can just, I'll just try and summarise. You can read what I've said there, but the missionaries, I think those sort of encapsulate who they were. They were extremely strong in their faith. They needed to be to come here and to deal with what they did. Most of them were committed to a lifetime of work in New Zealand and died here as older people. They believed in a personal conversion and salvation. They thought that would reform society, and they also believed in good works. But they were from another culture. They were from Victorian England. They were Eurocentric. How could they really not be? They could be, as you see, paternalistic, self-righteous judgment. And one of the things I think that perhaps is different to the way we would visit another country today, they weren't interested in another version of God. They weren't really interested in any Maori concepts of spirituality. So what are their effects? Well, yes, they were agents of colonisation. And historian James Ballard, who's been pretty tough on the whole colonisation process, calls them agents of virtue in a world of vice. The written language that they introduced absolutely transformed Maori society, and so did Christianity. And Christianity is still, it's still such a fundamental part of Maori society, Maori culture today. And a lot of the ceremonial stuff that happens, Christianity is become. The agriculture, the medicine, all the technology, the farming stuff transformed the Maori economy. And actually Maori, by the 1850s, were into the cash economy, and some tribes were becoming quite wealthy. And of course they brought an end to the intertribal warfare and slavery. As people converted, they stopped tattooing because the missionaries were in favour of the tattoos. So someone like an Aotearoa-New Zealand became a Christian before he was old enough to be tattooed. And his generation, most of them are not tattooed. And a lot of other things, they had a pretty substantial influence on the Maori culture. The efforts to establish a Maori church were pretty woeful. And the wars really were a real final nail in the coffin in a lot of ways. Now, we can just think about this whole process in a number of ways. There is this theory that was very prevalent for a long time, fatal impact, that the process of colonisation is just completely destructive, and Maori had to, and other cultures as well, had to assimilate or die out. And the culture was essentially destroyed. That's probably being replaced now with this idea that people seem to be talking about much more now, is the idea of Maori agency. As I tried to show you earlier on, the first mission was really a partnership, and they were invited to come, and there was an effort to set up something that was going to be of value to both sides. And throughout the whole process of Christianity, Maori have taken what they wanted. Yes, that's a good idea, we'll use that, we'll blend that in there, we'll mix it a little bit, and we'll create our own form of this new faith. And they've adapted it to their own purposes. So that's probably a more modern interpretation of what happened. And then I had a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago that I thought was really interesting, a very fine gentleman who comes from the Rangihoa area. And his people talk about them being prepared for Marsden to come. They talk about some sort of prophetic coming, that their people had prophesied that something dramatic was coming, and they had started to prepare themselves for the coming of Jesus Christ on the line. Now this is getting into a little bit of the area of the work of the Holy Spirit. I said I wasn't going to get into theology, but it was just interesting that that's how his people in that area are perceiving this whole process. And with that, I'll just finish. Thank you. Now I'm sure we've got some time for some questions. We don't have a mic for you, but you can speak up. We have, I know there's a number of people in the room here who can probably answer theological questions. But are there any questions or any observations that anyone has to make?
How old was Williams when he died?
He was in his 60s, 67, I think. Yeah. Williams actually fell out with Governor Gray, who accused him of buying too much land at one stage. And he was actually thrown out of the CMS temporarily. Yeah. Yes? Oh, sorry, this one.
Is it possible to, are any of the tracks still available? Have they been kept, the ones that were printed, the early ones? Can you see them in the museum?
I would think so, yes. I haven't seen any myself, but I would imagine some of them are around, yes. Yes.
There are some very interesting bits down in the mission house.
Oh, okay. There you go, yes. There are some interesting tracks down in the mission house from this period. Any other thoughts?
Could you speculate on how Maori might have transitioned from Stone Age to industrial age in 75 years without the Church Missionary Society? Would it have happened anyway?
So the question was, how would Maori have transitioned, you used the term Stone Age, but to the modern age in that period of time? Certainly the missionaries were, I think, a really important part of that. Obviously there was no turning back. You know, Europeans had arrived. There were a lot of dodgy characters here as well. So there was, you know, once the door was open, it can't be closed. And it was, I suspect it was probably good that the missionaries played as big a role as they did in that whole process.
Would trade have taken place and the knowledge of how to trade and what to trade, would that have happened without the...
Oh yes, so the question was, would trade have taken place? Yes, there's a lot of trade happening. Like there's the whaling and the sealing, there's a lot of
timber flax.
Timber flax, yeah. Even at that very early stage, a lot of intermarriage is happening in some of these little sort of communities. And as you saw, Maori were travelling a lot more than I think people realise. So yes, there was a lot, definitely a lot happening in the early stage. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
So the men attended the CMS training place. What about their wives? Were they trained on board, or were they just cold, very?
I think it was mainly the men who were. It was the men who were training there. I guess the wives prepared themselves as best they could. But some of the wives were not of the group that would have had a profession or a trade or something like that. So it was mainly the men who would do that. The jobs the wives tended to end up doing was running the household, and as I said, the children, and then sort of being thrown into the
But
role
did they
of
know
teaching.
what they were getting into?
I doubt it. The question was, did they know what they were getting into? I doubt it very much. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about Tavius Hatfield? Because he seems to be quite a standout missionary in those times that didn't sort of compromise too much with government and managed to walk a pretty good life in the Borough.
Yeah, I don't know an awful lot. Tavius Hatfield was based at Otaki. He was quite a sickly man, and he was actually thought he was dying back in England and decided that he would go into the mission field. If he was going to die, he was going to die doing something good. He's actually part of that Tawari story where the Gospel of St. Luke goes down to Rotorua and then down to Otaki, and they ask for a missionary, and he gets sent down there and is the missionary to those people. And as you say, he was very committed to that community down there. And one of the interesting offshoots from that is Purapraha had waged war against the Ngātahu people in the South Island and had some major victories at Aotearoa and Kaupoia. And his son, under the influence of Hatfield, becomes a Christian, goes to St. John's College, and then goes to the South Island and to all of those communities and apologises to them, asks for forgiveness, and takes the gospel to the South Island. Yeah, so he's tied up in that story. Way down the back.
Two things that I was wondering. If we wanted to read the diary that you talked about of Marion Williams, how would we do it? And, where would we get it? And the other one is, when you talked about the prophecies about that prepared the Māori for the Christian message to come, how would what would we read to find out more about that?
Okay. I think there's the Marion's diaries, I think it might be letters from the Bay. I've got a copy of it. It's written by Carolyn Fitzgerald. It's probably out of print, but it may be in the library. That last comment I made was purely, it was Buddy Macari's 70th birthday last weekend, and we had a party up at his house, and I was just sitting next to one of the men, and I got talking, and he said he was from that area, and that's how his people interpret that story, is that they were preparing the way. Yeah. So I don't have anything else.
Thank
I
you.
just thought it was an interesting perspective.
I can actually, Dylan, I could put you in touch with someone locally who would actually give you a bit more of that information.
Yeah. Yes.
We have a street called Grace Street. Do you know what happened to T.S. Grace?
Grace Street.
We've got Grace Street in
Yes,
town.
yes, we have.
Named after him.
Yes.
What did he actually do? What did T.S. Grace do?
Oh, well, I don't really know what happened to him in the end. The missionary T.S. Grace, does anyone know what happened to him in the end?
He went to Taupo.
Oh, okay.
Then I think died there.
Right.
So there's a monument to him, isn't there?
There's a headstone in the,
Yes.
yeah, there is. Yeah.
The driven man.
Right, yes.
The driven man.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he was
Grandson.
quite critical of a lot of the other missionaries, I think.
We had even a big fight from CMS
Yeah.
in England about it,
Yes.
because he wouldn't be a chaplain to the
For the troops.
troops,
Yeah.
and he nearly got dismissed.
Okay, thank you. Any other final thoughts?
Yeah, looking at the bigger picture, Almighty Father in heaven saw the threat of the Third Reich coming up, and Great Britain had to be built up in resources to tackle this foe of mankind. So he looks further into the future, knowing the infinite past. So everything that happened with the missionaries, bringing peace and goodwill to all mankind, was part of that plan. He could think into the future. And just like he's thinking into the future now before he returns in his full power and glory. Through his Son, he's preparing the church throughout the world to take the true gospel to mankind.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Final thoughts. John, would you want to say anything to conclude?
I'm always happy to say things. You know me. Firstly, thank you, Cliff. Somebody asked about Hatfield. I came from Wellington Diocese, and so some of the missionaries actually got dismissed by CMS because they were anti the war and were very vocal in their opposition to the New Zealand war. So Hatfield was one of those. They were reinstated down the line, but a lot of the settlers weren't happy with their opposition to what was going on. So Hatfield was one of those. When the first Bishop of Wellington was appointed, so the photograph up on the wall of the wives were actually all bishops' wives. The only true missionary wife there was Jane Williams, and all the others had come out here as the wives of bishops. And so one of them was Abraham. So he was the first Bishop of Abraham, but the role was offered to Hatfield, and he said, "I am too unwell. I will not live long enough. So appoint someone else." So they appointed Abraham. He died. So they came back to him and said, "Well, you're still around. how to give him a crack, he went out reluctantly, yes. And he lived for a long time. Apparently the climate down in Wellington suited him. So he didn't die. Well, he did eventually. So he is the second Bishop of Wellington. And one of the pieces that Cliff didn't talk about was during the war, we kind of alluded to it, Selwyn sent out a directive that the missionaries were to act as chaplains to the British Army if the soldiers ended up in their patch. And that really compromised them. So they weren't big fans of the kingitanga, but they could kind of scoot around that. But when the troops arrived here, for example, Brown had to act as the chaplain to the troops. That's what his bishop had told him to do it. And even they kind of were off to one side from Selwyn, he was still the bishop. So that really put them in a compromised position. And that made, that was the death knell, really, of many of the mission stations. And Selwyn acknowledged that when he left. He made a mistake, and he should not have done that. So thank you, Cliff. The story of the missionaries is amazing. One of the things that John Blunt pointed out was, when these guys retired, there was no pension. They couldn't go back to England. They had to stay here. So a lot of them get a lot of flack about the land they bought. They bought the land, and we could criticise some of the Williams land acquisitions. Not going to get into that. But Brown, for example, did buy some of the land down there, and that was so that his family had a way of making an income and supporting themselves once he stopped being a missionary. So, they came out here. Henry Williams had an income, but most of them didn't. It was incredibly hard work. It's an astounding story. So thank you, Cliff, for helping us get into that. So again, thank you, Cliff. So next week, Cliff and Buddy are going to talk about the Battle of Pa and Talanga, which a number of you have already heard. But I'm aware there are a lot of people who haven't heard it. There are a lot of people in Tauranga who still don't know the story of these important battles and why they're important for us to remember today. So I invite you to invite people along and encourage them to come. And then I think on the 14th of February, but you're going to have to keep an eye out for the advertising for this. We're still nailing this down. The Reverend Dr. Hilani Carr is coming. So some of you are of the generation. You may remember Honi Carr, who was on television. This is his son. Who's followed him. So one of the things that Cliff didn't talk about was, for us Pākehā, we kind of get to choose which denomination we're in. But for some Māori, your iwi affiliation dictates what you are. So if you're over the bridge in Pirirako land around Te Puna, you're Catholic. That's part of your whakapapa. You might go to another church, but fundamentally, you're Catholic. And on the East Coast, Ngāti Porou, you're Missionary, you're Anglican. And you might go to another church, or you might go to no church, but somewhere deep in your roots, you are Missionary. So that's one of our archbishops, Don Tamahere, comes from the East Coast. He's been Pentecostal, he's been all sorts of things, but at his roots, he was Missionary. So now he's one of our archbishops. And Hilani's the same, so it's kind of in his blood. So he's going to be talking on the 14th. And we're still nailing down what he's going to talk about. I've asked him to talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, because he does talk about that. But he has just put out a book based on his doctoral research about the missionary story from a Māori perspective. And one of the things that he was able to do as a Māori fluent in Te Reo Māori was he could go to the Alexander Turnbull Library and read all the letters that Māori wrote at the time, which people like me have no access to, because we can't read the language. So his thesis was, so here's the Anglican Church that grew out of this kind of interaction between Māori and Pākehā So what was the Māori perspective on that? What was their take on what was going on? What was their contribution? So I'm hoping he might be able to talk a bit about that, and he will probably bring some of his books for sale as well. No, didn't he? We will have our last few copies of Buddy and Cliff's books for sale next week as well. They are trying to get a reprint, but well, COVID has put up the cost of printing books, so they're just having to negotiate with the publisher about that. So that's next week is Battle of Pukehinahina with Buddy and Cliff, and then on the 14th, probably Hirani, and there is still a possibility of something happening on the 7th, but the guy we asked has disappeared. Yes.
I just want to thank you very much. I feel blessed to be in your fellowship here, that you've taken responsibility, but also the privilege of listening to you, talking about our people and the brethren, the people who came over, the missionaries who came over to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Māori and I love the Lord, and I came to the Lord through Christian brethren, people who walked over to Matapiki to bring the gospel, to teach us in Sunday school, and to come to our home. I love our Māori people, and they taught us some wonderful things about respecting the gods of the world who gave us so much. But I guess I want to thank you all very much for the European people and for the missionaries who brought the gospel to our people. I just want everybody to know that I'm blessed to be here with you, and thank you for that message that you give. But also thank you as well. I feel mahana, very warm, and being in your fellowship. There are not many fellowships that know Māori people, and sometimes I just feel I want to reach out and say, look, I'm born again, I love the Lord, like all of you here. So it's lovely to be here. I feel very warm, and thank you again, and we look forward to our relation. Buddy, to bring more of the richness of our combined fellowship. It doesn't matter, God created us all, and regardless of what religion or what race we are, He created us to love each other and to look after one another and to share again the gospel of Christ. Tēnei te rangatira e noho mai nei. Thank you for your words, and it's lovely being here, and with my husband, who's European, speaks the reo beautifully, because of the need to communicate with our Māori people. And our lovely friends here who were Puterere, the school, the headmaster of Puterere and his wife, whose love went out to the Māori people at Puterere. But thank you for being here, and bless you all, but thank you, Lord, for the missionaries that you spoke about, bringing the gospel and pass down to each generation to bring it to all of us. Not just Māori, but to everybody. So, taki te ano, ko te whakua.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I was quite surprised to have such a big crowd, and I hope to see some of you next week, and certainly hope to see some of you when Hirani is here. Have a good night, and safe travel home.